Hey, what's up you guys, and welcome back to MVR. If you've been in the possession of an Oculus Quest, then you know that Facebook is no stranger to introducing spec-altering features to their headsets well after launch. Two prime examples being the addition of Oculus Link, which enables full-fledged PCVR support, and the upgrade from 72Hz to 90Hz on the Oculus Quest 2. Curious to see if Facebook had any more tricks up its sleeve, Andrew Bosworth, the VP of Facebook Reality Labs, was asked during a Q&A session on Instagram about whether Quest 2 would see an update to 120Hz, upon which he promptly responded with a literal thumbs up to the question. So now you know that the Quest 2 is likely to get an update to 120Hz, but what will that mean for you as a user? And perhaps more importantly, are there any trade-offs? So in order to better answer that question, we first need to understand what refresh rate is actually good for. You see, one of the biggest challenges to producing a truly immersive and high-quality virtual reality experience has to do with the refresh rate, which in layman's terms refers to how many frames per second the virtual reality headset in question can produce. The faster the refresh rate is for any VR headset, the more fluid the experience is. And the more fluid the experience is, the less choppy it is, and the less it lags. A good example can be seen in the following footage where the same scene in the same game is being viewed at varying refresh rates. This is the exact same PC. The only difference is the refresh rate of the monitor. Notice how in the lower refresh rate footage, it appears like the image is cutting from one shot to the next, while in the footage with the higher refresh rate, it looks more like a real moving image. Now, some of you might look at some of the slower, choppier footage and ask what the big deal is. And that's a fair question. If we were only talking about refresh rates in the context of non-competitive flat-screen gaming, then as long as it doesn't bother the user, then usually there's no problem. After all, for a long time, video game consoles have traditionally run at a much more limited frame per second cap compared to PC gaming, and there are naturally a huge number of users that simply don't care. But when we're talking in the context of VR, having a lower refresh rate could actually mean having a higher chance of getting VR motion sickness, with symptoms often including disorientation, headaches, and feelings of nausea. This is very similar to regular motion sickness, and it happens when a number of your natural senses seem to disagree on whether or not you're moving, and sometimes how you're moving. So if you move your head in virtual reality, but the screen is slow on updating the image, then at first it would seem like you weren't moving while turning your head. Well, just a moment later, the screen would update and show movement while you're now not moving at all. And this causes a great deal of confusion for our senses. Normally, we can rely on what is known as the vestibular system, which is located in our inner ear to detect when we are moving, and then pair that with input from our other senses to confirm that what we're feeling is correct. So when the things that we see do not line up with what our brain expects to happen, it causes a slight subconscious panic. And it's this panic reaction in our brain that causes motion sickness, which we all know is something that we would rather avoid. Now, while it's clear there are many factors at play when it comes down to whether or not our user experiences motion sickness, it is clear that having a higher refresh rate can reduce the likelihood of you experiencing it. So now that we have a good understanding of why a higher refresh rate is beneficial, let's take a look at the last time the Quest 2 got an update like this. It might be hard to forget, but when the Quest 2 first launched, it only supported a 72Hz refresh rate, just like the Quest 1. And while Facebook did announce that 90Hz mode was on its way, a lot of apps simply were not ready yet to make the jump. You see, even if the headset itself would force the screens to run at 90Hz, if the app that's running doesn't produce enough frames to show, then it won't make much of a positive difference. And upgrading the code of an app to produce more frames when it initially wasn't designed to do so is not always an easy task. Depending on the game, all sorts of systems like physics are completely reliant on the amount of frames produced. And since each frame would bring along with it another calculation for the physics, it would also greatly increase the amount of processing power required to run a game. So if your game was already running near the maximum of the Quest's capacity, then you would have to either find really clever optimization tricks to reduce the processing costs of your code, or you would be forced to take certain features out to reduce the burden that way. Now, this is if we're talking about apps that run on the Quest itself. If we're using Oculus Link, however, we run into a different set of issues. You see, the Quest was originally only designed as a standalone headset, so it never came with a dedicated display connection to drive the screen and return the input data to the game. Instead, the Quest made clever use of its USB connection in combination with a fiber optic cable to send data back and forth, which is also one of the reasons why the official Oculus Link cable was so expensive. Now, in order to drive down the cost of Oculus Link, Facebook worked on developing some really impressive compression algorithms that enabled them to send just enough data over much simpler cables too. One of the drawbacks of this would be that the image quality also suffered for it, since lossless compression simply wasn't possible with the amount of data that they were sending. So when the Quest 2 was working on getting apps running in 90Hz mode, Facebook also had to update their compression algorithms to be able to drive more data without having to take a bigger loss on graphical quality, which is something that they actually managed to do in the end. So that sort of perfectly brings us back to our original question. How likely is it that the Quest 2 will get 120Hz support? And if the Quest 2 were to get 120Hz support, what would that mean for you as a user? Well, considering the VP of Facebook Reality Labs himself has indicated that this will be happening, it seems to be less of a question of if, but more of a question of how and when. And it's especially the how portion of that question that I find more interesting. If we look back at the original 90Hz introduction, we did see that the Quest's core apps and a number of big-name apps made the jump. But even now, there's still games on the Quest store that do not run in 90Hz, and the store itself doesn't have any indication whatsoever on whether or not games support the feature. Add 120Hz support into the mix, and you will get quite a confusing situation. So sure, the core apps will make the jump, but how many other apps will follow? If I buy my Quest 2 at some later point in time, fully expecting to be able to play all of my Quest games in 120Hz, how will I deal with the games that turn out to only run at 90Hz, or even at 72Hz? I think the Oculus store will definitely need some kind of labeling to indicate which is which in order to inform users and create more realistic expectations. On the Oculus Link side of things, we will likely also face some challenges. Facebook might be able to pull off another software engineering miracle with some new compression algorithm, but there's going to be no escaping a certain trade-off. Either users will have to compromise on image quality and get a blurrier picture in order to get a higher refresh rate, or users will have to possess more powerful hardware in order to keep up with the overhead of an increasingly more complex compression algorithm, on top of running an already demanding VR game. So taking all of the previous points into account, I would say that the most likely timeline for this rollout would be as follows. An early experimental version may be somewhere between April and June, followed by an official release somewhere in October. But that's just speculation on my part, so take that bit with a grain of salt. So that leaves us with the final portion of our question then. What would 120Hz support mean for you as a user? Well, one thing would be that we should be able to expect smoother gameplay in apps that support it, which in turn is also less likely to give us motion sickness, which is definitely a good thing. On the con side of things, we can expect a shorter battery life when running the Quest 2 in standalone mode, either reduced graphical quality or increased PC requirements when using Oculus Link, likely continued confusion on what refresh rates are supported by which apps, and possibly more reduced graphical quality or complexity in future Quest apps to meet the 120Hz threshold that Oculus is likely to push in the future. So there you have it, a full rundown of what refresh rate means for VR, and especially what the pros and cons are for a 120Hz mode on the current gen Oculus Quest 2. For me especially, I think Facebook would do well to start listing the supported refresh rates for new and existing apps going forward. So I know this was a little bit of a different format than usual, but I hope that the information provided was somehow useful. Let me know if you would like to see more videos in this format in the comments down below. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll be sure to see you guys next time.